The coffee in my hand had gone cold an hour ago, but I kept holding it anyway. Something about the weight of the cup made me feel less invisible. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, Chicago glittered like someone had scattered a handful of diamonds across a black velvet cloth. Inside, the open-plan office of Hargrove Capital smelled like fresh carpet and ambition. 60 employees sat in rows of polished desks, tapping at keyboards, answering phones, chasing quarterly targets. And somewhere in that building, in a corner office I had never been allowed near, my father sat behind a mahogany desk making decisions that moved millions of dollars before most people finished their morning cereal. Nobody here knew who I was. That was the point. 6 weeks earlier, my father had called me into that same corner office not as a CEO summoning an employee, but as a father sitting across from his daughter at a small table by the window, pouring 2 cups of coffee himself instead of asking his assistant to do it. He slid one toward me and said, quietly, "I need you to go in, as nobody. Just watch." I had asked him what he was looking for. He had looked out the window for a long moment before answering, "I'll know it when you tell me." So I became Emma Hartwell, junior analyst, fresh out of a state school, carrying a resume that was technically true in every detail except the one that mattered most. My last name was real. Hargrove was my mother's maiden name, and she had given it to me when she and my father separated years ago, long before he built any of this. Nobody at Hargrove Capital made the connection. Why would they? The CEO's daughter was rumored to be living in New York, working in finance under a different name entirely. People believe the stories they're already expecting to hear. My cubicle was in the far corner of the analyst pool, next to the printer that always jammed and the emergency exit that someone had propped open with a brick so the smokers didn't have to badge back in. My desk neighbor was a woman named Sophie, mid-30s, sharp eyes, quick laugh, the kind of person who noticed everything and said only about 40% of what she observed. She brought 2 coffees every morning, one for herself and one for whoever sat next to her, without ever making it a big deal. On my 3rd day, she slid a cup onto my desk without looking up from her screen and said, "You look like you take it black." I did. I still don't know how she knew. Sophie had worked at Hargrove Capital for 7 years. She knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking, and she had the instinctive survivor's habit of keeping her head down without ever losing her spine. Her mother had been sick for most of the past year, some kind of cardiac issue that required a specialist and a medication regimen that cost more than Sophie's rent. She never complained about it. I only found out because she once took a call at her desk, thinking I wasn't back from lunch yet, and I heard her voice go soft and careful in a way that told me she was talking to a doctor. I liked Sophie immediately and trusted her completely, which, given why I was there, I probably shouldn't have let happen that fast. The first few weeks were quiet. I did my work, filed my reports, attended the Monday briefings where the department head ran through targets in a voice that suggested he had given up finding any of this interesting years ago. I watched. I took notes in a personal journal I kept encrypted on my phone. I was looking for what my father had sent me to find, though I still wasn't entirely sure what that was. Then he arrived. His name was Brandon, and he walked into the office on a Tuesday morning like the building had been waiting for him specifically. He was maybe 32, with the kind of confidence that doesn't come from accomplishment, but from a lifetime of being told you don't need any. He wore a suit that cost more than my monthly rent and carried a leather portfolio that I later noticed he never actually opened. The VP of operations met him at the elevator and shook his hand with both of his, the way people shake hands with someone they're slightly afraid of. By noon, everyone on the floor knew the story. Brandon was the CEO's son. He had spent the last several years working at the company's London office, learning the business from the international side, and now he was back in Chicago to prepare for the eventual transition of leadership. He would be sitting in on department meetings, reviewing operational processes, and getting to know the teams. His word, the VP made clear, carried the weight of the CEO's office. I sat at my desk and watched him move through the office like he owned it. Which, to be fair, he believed he did. I called my father that evening from my apartment, standing at the kitchen window with the city lights bleeding soft through the glass. "Did you know about this?" I asked. There was a pause that told me everything. "That's why I needed you there," he said. "Who is he?" Another pause. Longer this time. "That's what I need you to find out." I didn't sleep well that night. The changes started small. Brandon sat in on the Tuesday strategy meeting and asked two questions that were technically intelligent but practically disruptive, the kind of questions designed not to get answers but to signal authority. He had the VP pull 3 reports that weren't due until end of quarter. He toured the analyst pool and made a point of stopping at certain desks, asking people their names, nodding slowly as if filing the information away for future reference. He stopped at my desk last. "Emma," he said, reading my nameplate. "How long have you been with us?" 6 weeks, I said. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And how are you finding it?" "It's a great company," I said. Which was true. He smiled, but only with his mouth. "Good," he said, and moved on. Sophie leaned over after he walked away and said, under her breath, "Don't let him hear you sound too comfortable. Comfortable people get restructured." I looked at her. "Has this happened before?" She turned back to her screen. Different cast, same show. Over the next 2 weeks, Brandon settled into the office like a weather system. His presence shifted the atmosphere of every room he entered. He established a standing morning meeting with department heads that ran long and ended with vague, slightly threatening remarks about accountability. He sent emails at 11 at night that required responses by 8 in the morning. He had one of the conference rooms reassigned as his personal workspace, displacing 3 teams who had used it for weekly client calls. And he started cutting people. The first one was Marcus, in data analytics, 10 years with the company, solid performer, the kind of employee who knew the systems so well that his institutional memory was worth more than his job title. Marcus was called into a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon and walked out 45 minutes later carrying a cardboard box. He stopped at the door, looked back once at the office, and then left without saying anything. Nobody gathered to say goodbye. Everyone was too busy pretending they hadn't noticed. The second was Janet from Client Relations. The third was a junior analyst named Derek who had, from what I could tell, committed no offense other than pushing back on one of Brandon's restructuring suggestions in a meeting. Sophie and I ate lunch together in the building's small courtyard on the Friday after Derek left. She was quieter than usual, turning a plastic fork over in her fingers without eating. "He's building something," she said finally. "Or clearing space for something. I can't tell which yet. Have you talked to HR?" She gave me a look that said I had revealed, just slightly, how little I understood about how this worked. HR reports to operations. Operations reports to him right now. Who exactly would I be talking to? I called my father that night and told him what I had seen. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Keep going." "How long?" I asked. "A little longer," he said. "Please." The next Monday, Brandon announced what he called a performance alignment initiative. Every analyst would be reviewed against a new metric framework he had developed. Reviews would be completed within 30 days. Anyone who did not meet the new benchmarks would be subject to role evaluation, which everyone understood to mean termination. The framework itself was strange, weighted heavily toward metrics that were difficult to measure and easy to manipulate, like strategic vision, contribution, and cultural alignment score. Sophie and I sat in the all-hands meeting and listened, and I watched her jaw tighten by small degrees as Brandon walked through the slides. Afterward, back at our desks, she pulled up the framework document he had distributed and read through it quietly. Then she turned to me and said, "These aren't performance metrics. They're a firing mechanism with plausible deniability." She was right. I knew she was right. And I also knew something she didn't, which was that I had seen this document before. Not this exact version, but the same architecture, the same weighted categories, the same language. I had seen it in a filing that had come across my desk during the 3rd week, misfiled into the wrong folder, and I had photographed it before returning it to the right place. I had sent the photograph to my father. He had not responded. The review period began. The office became tense in a way that was almost physical. Conversations shortened, lunches were eaten at desks, people stayed late not because there was work to do but because leaving early felt like making yourself a target. Sophie arrived earlier and stayed later than anyone. I watched her work with a kind of quiet ferocity, building documentation for everything, keeping records of every client interaction, every completed deliverable, every email response time. She was preparing a defense for a trial she hadn't been charged with yet. I was in the break room on a Thursday afternoon when I overheard 2 of Brandon's people talking in the hallway outside. They weren't being careful about their volume, which told me they didn't think anyone nearby mattered enough to worry about. The Hargrove girl, supposedly in New York. Does she know about the restructuring? She's not involved. The old man barely talks to her anymore. This is clean. I stood very still with my coffee cup and listened. What about the board vote? Once the legacy staff is cleared out and the new framework is in, the numbers will look different. That's what he needs for the board. He's got 2 members already. And the CEO? A pause. Then, the CEO is the last piece. I walked back to my desk slowly and sat down and stared at my screen without seeing it. Sophie looked over at me once and didn't say anything, which was the right call. That evening I called my father for the 2nd time in one day, something I hadn't done since I was 12 and he was still living with us. He picked up on the first ring. I told him everything I had heard, word for word, the way I had been trained to repeat things back accurately. He was very quiet while I spoke. When I finished, I heard him exhale slowly, the kind of breath that carries more weight than words. "Dad," I said, using a word I almost never used with him. "Who is he, really?" A long silence. Then, his mother was my CFO 17 years ago. We had a relationship that ended badly. He was born 8 months after she left the company. She told me for years that he wasn't mine. I believed her because it was easier to believe her. He stopped. She died 2 years ago. He found paperwork in her things. He came to me with it 6 months ago. I sat down on my kitchen floor without meaning to. "Is it true?" I asked. "I don't know," my father said, and the honesty in his voice hurt more than a lie would have. "I genuinely don't know. But he does, or he believes he does, and he's not waiting for me to figure it out. He's trying to take the company," I said. "He's trying to take it before I decide he can't have it," my father said. "There's a difference. He thinks I'm going to shut him out the way his mother told him I shut her out. He's moving first. The board vote." "I know about the board vote," my father said quietly. "I've known for 3 weeks. Then why haven't you stopped it?" Another silence. "Because I'm not sure I have the right to." I stayed on the kitchen floor for a long time after we hung up. The next morning I came in early. The office was nearly empty, just the facilities team running vacuums along the far wall and the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere near the mailroom. I made coffee in the break room and stood at the window and watched the city wake up. And I thought about my father saying, "I'm not sure I have the right to." And I thought about Sophie documenting her work like she was preparing to fight for her livelihood. And I thought about Marcus carrying his cardboard box to the elevator. And I thought about what it meant to inherit something you had never asked for. Brandon's performance alignment reviews were scheduled to begin the following Monday. Sophie's name was on the first day roster. I had seen the preliminary scores that someone had left, again, in the wrong folder. Whether by accident or by someone who wanted me to see them, I was no longer sure. Sophie's scores on the subjective metrics were low enough that the outcome was already decided before the conversation happened. I went home that Friday evening and sat at my kitchen table and wrote out everything I knew in a single document, the misfiled framework, the conversation I had overheard, the preliminary review scores, the board vote timeline, my father's history with Brandon's mother, the 17-year gap, the paperwork from a dead woman's belongings that had started all of this. Then I called my father and I told him I was done waiting. "I need you to come in Monday morning," I said. Not as a CEO who doesn't know what's happening in his own building, as my father, and as the person who has to decide, right now, what this company is actually for. He was quiet for a long time. "What time?" he said finally. 8 o'clock, I said. "Before Brandon's reviews start." I got to the office at 7:30. Sophie was already there. She looked up when I walked in, then looked back at her screen without saying anything. She had a coffee waiting on my desk. At 7:55, the elevator opened and my father walked out. He was 61 years old, and he moved through a room the way people do when they have spent decades being the most consequential person present, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a kind of gravitational pull that made other people unconsciously orient toward him. He was wearing a dark gray suit and he was carrying nothing except his phone. He stopped when he reached the center of the analyst pool and looked around at the office slowly, taking it in the way you take in something you built and haven't examined carefully in a long time. Sophie spun around in her chair and went completely still. I stood up from my desk. My father looked at me, and in front of everyone who had started to arrive for the morning, in front of Sophie, who was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, in front of the VP of operations who had just come out of the kitchen and gone pale, my father crossed the room and put his hand on my shoulder and said, clearly enough to carry, "Thank you for calling me." Brandon walked off the elevator 40 minutes later. He stopped when he saw my father standing at the head of the conference table in the room he had claimed as his own. He stopped again, more visibly, when he saw me standing next to my father. My father said, "Come in," and closed the door. What happened in that room over the next hour and a half was something I have thought about many times since. There was no shouting. My father is not a man who shouts. He laid out what I had documented, piece by piece, methodically, the way you present a case to someone who already knows they've lost but needs to understand the scope of it. Brandon's jaw tightened and then went loose and then tightened again. He tried, twice, to reframe what he had been doing as legitimate business strategy. My father listened to both attempts with the particular patience of someone who has been in enough rooms with enough people to know the difference between an argument and a performance. At one point, Brandon said, "You owe me this, after what you did to my mother." My father said, "I owe you a conversation we should have had a year ago, and I owe you an honest answer about the question you've been carrying since you found those papers. I don't owe you a company you tried to take by dismantling the people who built it with me." Brandon was quiet after that for a long time. The DNA test that my father had already quietly ordered came back 3 weeks later. The result was not the one Brandon had built his entire plan around. His mother had been telling the truth for 17 years, and then, at the end of her life, had changed her story for reasons that died with her. The paperwork he had found was a fabrication, not a crude one, but a fabrication nonetheless. I don't know exactly what my father said to Brandon in the private meeting they had after the results came back. I wasn't in the room. Whatever it was, Brandon left the company quietly, without litigation, and the 3 board members who had been in his corner recused themselves from the upcoming vote without explanation. The employees Brandon had let go were called. Marcus came back first, the following week, and I watched him walk back to his old desk and sit down and open his computer like he was picking up exactly where he had left off. Janet came back 2 weeks after that. Derek, I was told, had already accepted a position elsewhere and was happy there, and we wished him well. Sophie found out who I was the day after my father came to the office, when the internal announcement went out confirming my role. She didn't say anything to me when she read it. She sat at her desk for a while reading her screen, and then she turned around and looked at me very directly and said, "Is the coffee still going to be black?" "Yes," I said. "Okay," she said, and turned back to her work. A month later, I sat down with the benefits administrator and quietly arranged for the specialist costs associated with Sophie's mother's cardiac care to be covered under an expanded employee assistance provision that had, until then, been underutilized. I did not tell Sophie it was coming. I let her find out when the billing office called her to say the balance had been cleared and future appointments were covered. She came to my desk an hour later. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at me. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. She nodded once, slowly, the way she acknowledged things she had already decided to accept. Then she went back to her desk and we didn't talk about it again, which was exactly right. My father and I had dinner the night the DNA results came back, just the 2 of us, at a small Italian place he had been going to for 30 years, where they knew his usual table and didn't make a fuss about it. We ordered the same thing we always ordered when we used to do this, before life got complicated. Before I grew up, and we grew apart in the way parents and children sometimes do when neither of them quite knows how to talk about the gap. He told me that he had been watching me for years, waiting until he trusted that I understood what he had built well enough to be responsible with it. He said that what I had done in those 2 months, not just the documentation, not just the call, but the way I had treated the people around me, the way I had let Sophie matter to me before I knew I could do anything about it, the way I had stayed in a cubicle next to a jammed printer and eaten lunch in a courtyard and done the actual work alongside people who had no idea who I was, that had been the answer to a question he had been asking for a long time. I told him I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever came next. He said, "I wasn't either. Nobody is. That's not actually the question." I looked at him across the table, at the man who had built something real and nearly lost it to someone's grief and anger and a dead woman's last act of revision, and I thought about what it meant to inherit not just a company, but the weight of everyone inside it. Sophie and her mother's medical bills, Marcus and his 10 years of institutional memory, all the people who had come to work every day inside something my father had built and trusted without knowing that the hands holding it were worth trusting. "What is the question?" I asked. He picked up his wine glass and turned it slightly in the light. "Whether you'll do it better than I did," he said. "That's all." The elevator opened on the 42nd floor on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after I had first walked through those doors as nobody. The carpet still smelled like ambition. The windows still looked out over a city of scattered diamonds. Sophie was already at her desk with 2 coffees, and she didn't look up when I walked in, just slid one toward my side of the desk partition with the ease of long habit. I sat down. I picked up the cup. It was black. Still warm. I opened my laptop and got to work.